It was a cloudy, gray afternoon, typical of autumn, when Claire hurried home from another shift at the hospital. The cold wind enveloped her as she walked through the busy city streets. She didn't know exactly why, but something made her feel restless that day. Perhaps it was the weather, or the accumulated exhaustion of so many days caring for patients. In any case, she stopped at a small corner cafe, more on impulse than out of necessity. "A chicken sandwich and a coffee, please," she asked the attendant. While waiting, Claire looked out of the window and saw something that made her stop for a moment. Across the street, under the marquee of a closed store, a man was sitting on the ground, huddled up, trying to protect himself from the fine rain that was starting to fall. His clothes were worn, and his empty gaze stared into nothingness. Claire took his order, but couldn't move on. Something about that man gave her an uncomfortable feeling that she couldn't ignore. Without a second thought, she crossed the street, the wind ruffling her coat, and stopped in front of him. "Hi," she said. Her voice soft, almost hesitant. The man raised his eyes slowly, as if it were difficult to concentrate. He seemed surprised that someone was talking to him. "Are you hungry?" she asked, holding out the sandwich. The man looked at the sandwich, then at Claire, as if pondering whether to accept it. His expression was tired, but there was also something else there, something that Claire couldn't define. "Yes," he murmured, finally accepting the food with trembling hands. "Thank you." Claire sat down next to him, ignoring the cold and the rain that was beginning to soak the ground around her. "What's your name?" she asked. "Robert," he replied after a pause. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone for a long time. "I'm Claire. I work at the hospital near here." She tried to smile, but Robert seemed immersed in his own thoughts. After a few minutes in silence, Robert began to speak, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I once had a good life," he said, looking down at the wet sidewalk. "I had a wife, 2 children, my own business." Claire remained silent, listening. He seemed to want to get something off his chest, and she wasn't going to interrupt him. "Everything fell apart after my wife died," he continued, his voice getting weaker. "Fire. I couldn't save her." He stopped, taking a deep breath, as if reliving that painful moment. "After that, I lost everything. My job, my house, and then the addictions." He hesitated, as if he didn't want to admit it, but he continued. "Drugs. That's how I lost my children too. They were taken away and adopted by other families. I don't know where they are." Claire felt a lump in her throat. The pain in Robert's words was palpable. She looked at him, feeling a connection she couldn't explain. His words echoed inside her, awakening an old wound that had never fully healed. "I was adopted too," she said softly. It was the first time she had talked about it with anyone in so long. "I never knew my biological family." Robert turned his face towards her, for the first time seeming truly present in the conversation. "So you know what it's like." He sighed deeply, as if the weight of his words had finally been lifted. "It's like a part of you is missing, isn't it?" Claire nodded, feeling a tear threaten to fall, but she held it back. That moment wasn't about her. It was about that man, sitting in the rain, carrying the weight of a lifetime of losses and regrets. "Yes, I know," she replied, her voice filled with empathy. Silence settled between them again, but this time it seemed more comfortable, as if somehow they had found a little relief in the simple act of sharing their stories, however briefly. After a while, Robert looked at her with a firmer gaze. "Thank you, Claire. I don't know why you stopped to talk to me today, but thank you." Claire smiled slightly, still sitting next to him, as the rain fell around her. She couldn't explain it, but something in that conversation had touched her deeply. Something she knew she couldn't just leave behind. "I needed that too, Robert," she said, getting up slowly. "Take care of yourself, okay?" He nodded as she slowly walked away, but deep down, Claire knew that this wouldn't be the last time she would see Robert. Something was changing inside her, and she had the feeling that this was just the beginning of a journey she hadn't anticipated. Over the next few days, Claire couldn't get Robert out of her mind. The man she met in the street seemed to carry more than just the sadness of someone who has lost everything. There was a deep pain in his words, a story of loss that wasn't limited to what he said in that brief encounter. Something in her resonated strangely, as if there was a connection she couldn't yet understand. At work, while seeing patients, her mind often wandered to Robert's story. How could someone fall from so high up and end up on the streets, forgotten by the world? And even more disturbing, what would it be like to live knowing that your children were somewhere, but completely out of your reach? One afternoon after work, Claire decided to do what her heart had been asking her to do for days. She needed to see Robert again. Perhaps it was to help him in some way, or perhaps it was out of her own need to understand more about that story. So after leaving the hospital, she returned to the marquee where she had first met him. Robert was there in the same place, as if he had never left. But this time, he looked even more dejected, as if the weight of his past was finally consuming him. Claire sat down next to him again, this time without hesitation. "Claire," Robert murmured, recognizing her immediately, although his voice was a little weaker. "Hi, Robert. How are you?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "Surviving," he replied with a sad smile. There was something different that night, a need for both of them to talk more deeply, as if there was something unsaid between them. Claire took a deep breath and plucked up the courage to ask what had been plaguing her since their first meeting. "You talked about your children, about how you lost them," Claire began, trying to find the right words. "What was that like? I mean, how did you end up here?" Robert sighed, his gaze lost in the darkness of the street. After a moment of silence, he began to speak, and this time his story came out more fluidly, as if he had finally decided to get everything off his chest. "After my wife died, I just fell apart. It was as if my whole life had been destroyed in a single night. The fire, I can still hear her screams. I should have done something, but I couldn't." He stopped, breathing hard as if reliving that tragic moment. "And that's when I started using drugs, trying to numb the pain. I thought it would help me forget, but it only made it worse. I lost my business, my house, and eventually, my children." Claire felt her heart clench as she listened. She couldn't imagine the pain Robert must have felt. "And his children? What happened to them?" she asked, her voice low, almost afraid of the answer. "The state took them away from me when they realized that I could no longer take care of them," Robert continued, sadness weighing on every word. "They were separated, sent to different families. I never saw them again. I didn't know where they were, and at that point," he paused, his gaze empty. "They must hate me, if they even remember me." Claire remained silent, letting Robert's words resonate inside her. His story was tragic, but somehow very familiar. She herself had been adopted as a child. She had never met her birth parents, and as far as she knew, they had never tried to find her. "I was adopted too," said Claire, not sure why she was sharing this. "I never knew my biological family. All I know is what's on the adoption papers. But I always felt that there was something strange about it, as if parts of my history had been erased." Robert looked at her for the first time with real attention. "Have you tried to find out more about your family?" Claire shook her head. "Not much. I think I've always been afraid of what I might find, or perhaps of not finding anything at all. But now," she hesitated, not sure how to explain. "After hearing your story, I feel like I need to look, like there's something I need to know." Robert smiled, although it was a sad smile. "I think we're all trying to find something, aren't we? Something we've lost along the way." Claire was silent for a moment, reflecting on his words. The truth was that, although she had had a good life with her adoptive family, she had always felt that something was missing. And now, after hearing Robert's story, that feeling of emptiness seemed stronger than ever. "I'm going to find out more about my adoption," she finally said. "And I'm going to help you, Robert. Maybe we can't change the past, but we can try to make a new start." Robert didn't reply immediately. His eyes were full of gratitude, but also of a deep weariness, as if he had already given up hope that anything could change in his life. "Thank you, Claire," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You don't know how much this means to me." Claire smiled, even though she knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, she felt she was doing the right thing, both for Robert and for herself. And so the two of them sat together under the marquee as the rain fell gently around them, sharing an unexpected connection, forged by the wounds of a painful past and the hope of a better future. After that night, Claire felt increasingly determined to find out what lay behind her adoption. Something in Robert's words had awakened a curiosity she had never had before. When she was younger, she had always avoided delving into her past, perhaps for fear of being disappointed or out of loyalty to her adoptive family, who had always treated her well. But now there was a need for answers. The next morning, Claire went to her foster parents' house. They had always been loving and understanding, and she knew she could talk to them about it. When she arrived, her mother, Ellen, welcomed her with a warm smile. "Claire, what a nice surprise, darling. How are you?" asked Ellen as she led her into the living room. "I'm fine, Mom," Claire replied, trying to sound calm, but her heart was racing. After a few minutes of light conversation, Claire finally plucked up the courage to broach the subject. "Mom, I need to ask you something. About my adoption." Ellen was silent for a moment, looking surprised. Although they had never hidden the fact that Claire was adopted, it wasn't something they talked about often. "Of course, dear. What do you want to know?" Ellen asked a little hesitantly. "I was wondering, I never really asked about the details. How was the adoption? Do you know anything about my birth family?" Ellen took a deep breath, seeming to ponder how to answer. Finally, she leaned forward with a serious but affectionate expression. "Well, the truth is that it was a quick process. Your father and I had been on the adoption list for some time, and one day we received a call saying that there was a baby available. We didn't know much about your biological family, except that your mother, well, she couldn't take care of you." Claire frowned, sensing that there was more to the story. "Is that all? There's nothing else in the records?" Ellen hesitated again, as if deciding whether to say more. Finally, she got up and went to a drawer in the living room, from which she pulled out an old, worn folder. She handed it to Claire. "Here are all the documents we received at the time. There's not much, but maybe you'll find something that can help." Claire opened the folder carefully, as if she were handling something fragile. There were the adoption papers with dates, signatures, and some basic information. But one thing caught her eye. There was a name, the name of the birth mother, Anna Smith. That was all there was to it. No more details, just a generic name that didn't help much. "Anna Smith," Claire whispered, almost to herself. "Isn't there any more information about her?" Ellen shook her head. "No, dear. In those days, many details were omitted or not formally recorded. But Claire, you know that, for us, you've always been our daughter, and that will never change." Claire smiled at her adoptive mother, feeling the genuine love in her words. She knew that her search was not a question of loyalty, but of something deeper, a need to understand her roots. "I know, Mom, you've always been incredible to me. I just feel like I need to find out more about where I came from, you know?" Ellen nodded, understanding. "Of course, dear. If it's important to you, we support you. Just be careful, because sometimes what you find isn't what you expect." Claire knew her mother was right. The path she was about to follow might bring answers that wouldn't necessarily comfort her, but she felt she had to keep going. After saying goodbye to her parents, she returned home, carrying the folder with the documents. That evening, Claire stared at the name Anna Smith over and over again, trying to make sense of something that seemed so generic. Without many other resources, she decided to contact the orphanage where she had been adopted, in the hope that they could provide more information. The next day, Claire called the orphanage. After a few minutes of waiting, a calm voice answered on the other end. "St. Mary's Orphanage, how can I help?" "Hi, my name is Claire, and I was adopted through you a few years ago. I'm trying to find out more information about my adoption. Do you have any additional records about my birth mother?" The woman on the other end of the line asked Claire to hold while she checked the files. A few minutes later, she came back on the line, but her voice sounded cautious. "We have some old records here, but there's not much. It seems that your adoption was done with some urgency. There are mentions that your birth mother was in a difficult situation, but the details are vague. I don't know if that helps much." Claire was silent, processing the information. "Any chance there's something else? Any leads I can follow?" she asked, almost pleading. "Well, there's a note here saying that your birth mother was involved in an accident. A fire, actually. She survived, but it was right after that she gave you up for adoption." A chill ran down Claire's spine. A fire, the same tragedy that Robert had mentioned in his story. Her heart began to beat faster, and a feeling of dread settled in her stomach. A fire? She repeated, incredulous. Yes, that's what the records say, the woman replied, not realizing the impact those words had had on Claire. Claire thanked her quickly and hung up the phone. Her body was tense and her mind was spinning. It couldn't just be a coincidence. There was something very strange linking her story to Robert's. What if? Before she had finished thinking, Claire knew what she needed to do. Determined to unravel the mystery that seemed to link her story to Robert's, Claire returned to the place where she had first met him. The weather was milder that day and the sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky orange and pink. When she reached the marquee, however, Robert wasn't there. A feeling of unease came over her. She had promised herself that she would help him, but now he had disappeared. Claire asked some people in the neighborhood if they had seen Robert recently, but no one knew anything. Discouraged, she decided to go home and try to think of another way to find him. The next morning, Claire was surprised by some alarming news. As she flicked through the local paper, a small headline caught her eye. Homeless man seriously injured in downtown brawl. Her stomach churned as she read the article. The article mentioned that the man had been attacked by other homeless people and was in serious condition in the local hospital. Although his name wasn't mentioned, Claire knew it was Robert. Without wasting any time, Claire grabbed her things and rushed to the hospital where he was being held. When she arrived, she went straight to reception. "I'm looking for a homeless man who was recently admitted. I think he was attacked," she said, her voice laden with urgency. The receptionist looked at the computer and then at Claire. "We have a patient in the condition you described, but he's in intensive care and can't receive visitors yet," the woman replied calmly. "Is he alive?" asked Claire, her heart in her throat. "Yes, he's stable, but his condition is still serious." "What do you think of him?" asked the receptionist, visibly worried. Claire hesitated for a moment. "I'm a friend, please. I need to know when he can have visitors," she begged. The receptionist nodded and told her that he was still under observation, but that she could try again the next day. Claire thanked her and sat down in the waiting room, unable to leave the hospital. Although she knew she couldn't see him at the moment, the thought of leaving made her uncomfortable. While she was waiting, a young man approached her. He looked as distressed as Claire, pacing back and forth until he finally sat down next to her. "Are you also waiting to hear from someone?" he asked without looking directly at her. Claire looked at him, puzzled. "Yes, I'm here for a man called Robert. And you?" The young man looked at her with surprise and a mixture of hope. "Robert, I think he might be my father," he said in a shaky voice. "I've been trying to find my biological father for years, and I recently discovered that he might be a man called Robert who lives on the streets." Claire was silent, absorbing the information. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was it possible that the young man in front of her was another piece of the puzzle surrounding her own life? "I met Robert a few days ago," said Claire cautiously. "He told me that he had 2 children who were separated and adopted by different families." The young man looked at her intensely. "2 children?" he repeated, as if processing the information. "I was adopted when I was very young. I always knew I wasn't my parents' biological child, and I've been trying to find my family for years. Recently, I've gotten some clues, but it's all very confusing. If Robert really is my father, that means I have a brother or sister out there." Claire took a deep breath, feeling the tension growing in the air. The coincidence was too overwhelming to be just that. "What's your name?" she asked, feeling the weight of her own words. "Joe. And yours?" "Claire," she replied, her voice shaking. "And I was adopted too." The two looked at each other, the silence heavy between them. Claire felt her heart racing as tumultuous thoughts flooded her mind. Could it be possible? Could Robert be their biological father? The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. "I've recently started investigating my adoption," Claire continued, her voice low. "And I've discovered some strange things. The birth mother mentioned in my papers was involved in a fire. And when Robert told me his story, he mentioned the death of his wife. In a fire." Joe widened his eyes in surprise. "That can't be a coincidence," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Claire agreed slowly, still processing the enormity of the discovery. Fate had brought them together in a way she could never have predicted, and now they were both on the brink of a revelation that could change everything. "If Robert really is our father," Claire began hesitantly. "Then we're brother and sister," Joe added, still incredulous. The shock was palpable. They barely knew each other, but now they had to deal with the idea that their stories were intertwined in an unimaginable way. And most importantly, the man who was fighting for his life in the ICU was the key to all the answers they were looking for. "We have to wait for him to wake up," said Claire, breaking the silence. "He'll be able to tell us everything." Joe nodded, still looking stunned by the turn of events. "Yes, but what if he doesn't wake up?" That question hung in the air like a cloud of uncertainty. Claire didn't have an answer. All they could do now was wait and hope that Robert would recover, so that they could finally hear the truth from his own mouth. Claire looked at Joe, feeling an unexpected connection with this stranger, who suddenly seemed to be so much more than that. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. Claire and Joe continued to visit the hospital every day, waiting for news of Robert. The feeling that a great revelation was about to happen hung over them like an impending storm, but time seemed to drag on. At every visit, the doctors said the same thing. Robert was stable, but there was still no sign that he would wake up. One afternoon, Claire and Joe were sitting in the waiting room in silence. They were both exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Claire looked at Joe, who was tapping his feet nervously, and decided to break the silence. "What was it like for you growing up with foster parents?" she asked, trying to get to know him better. Joe sighed, seeming to hesitate before answering. "It was complicated. My foster parents were always good to me, but I always knew that something was missing. They tried to be loving, but I could never fully connect. I felt like a part of me was lost, you know?" Claire nodded, understanding perfectly what he meant. "I felt that too. My adoptive parents are amazing, but I never felt completely complete. Like I was always looking for something, even if I didn't know what it was." Joe looked at her, his eyes reflecting the same pain she felt. "And now I think we're finding what we were looking for," he said with a sad smile. Before Claire could reply, a doctor approached, interrupting the conversation. "Are you related to Robert?" asked the doctor with a serious expression. "Yes, we are," replied Joe without hesitation. The doctor paused, looking at them both carefully. "He's finally awake. He's conscious, but very weak. You can see him, but please don't burden him with too many questions. He needs time to recover." Claire and Joe exchanged glances, their anxiety growing. Finally, they would have the chance to hear the truth from Robert. They followed the doctor through the corridors to Robert's room. When they entered, the sight of the man they knew as a vulnerable, lost, homeless man now seemed even more fragile. He was lying in bed with tubes attached to him, but his eyes were open, and he was looking at them with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "Robert," Claire began, her voice soft. "How are you?" He took a deep breath, his voice hoarse as he tried to speak. "Claire, Joe," he seemed surprised to see them together. "You're here." Joe approached, taking a seat in the chair next to the bed. "We're here, Dad," said Joe, the words sounding strange in his mouth. "We have a lot of questions, but first, we want to know how you are." Robert smiled slightly, although it was a tired smile. "I'm better, I think. I don't know what happened. I just remember being in the street, and then everything went dark." "You were attacked," Claire explained, "but you're safe now." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the information. When he opened them again, his gaze seemed more focused, clearer. I didn't know you." He paused as if struggling to find the words. "Claire, Joe, you're my children, aren't you?" Claire felt a lump in her throat as Joe took Robert's hand and squeezed it gently. "We think so," replied Joe, his voice shaking. "Everything seems to point to that." Robert closed his eyes again, this time with tears streaming down his face. "I thought I'd never see you again," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "I lost you, and now you're here." Claire took a step forward and sat down on the side of the bed. "We're here, Robert, and we want to know what happened. We want to understand." Robert took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into a painful memory. It all started with the fire, he said, his voice shaking. I lost my wife that day. I tried, but I couldn't save her. After that, nothing made sense. I couldn't live with the guilt, so I gave in to addiction. It destroyed me, and I ended up losing you both to the foster care system. They took my children away from me because I was no longer able to look after you. Joe swallowed, feeling the pain in Robert's words. Claire felt the same. Although they knew the story was tragic, hearing it directly from Robert made it even more real and devastating. We don't blame you for this, Robert, said Claire, her voice full of empathy. We're not here to judge what happened in the past. We just want to understand and rebuild what we've lost. Robert looked at her, his eyes full of gratitude. I've never stopped thinking about you. Never, he said, his voice breaking. But I didn't know where you were. I never knew if you were well, if you had been adopted by good families. I prayed that you would have a better life than I could offer you. We were adopted by good families, said Joe, trying to comfort him. But we always felt that something was missing. Someone. Now we know what it was. Robert nodded slowly, still fighting back tears. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you back in my life. I've done so many things wrong. Claire held Robert's other hand, looking directly into his eyes. What matters now is that we're here, and we're going to get through this together. No matter what happened before, we're together now. The silence that followed was full of emotion. Robert, for the first time in years, was surrounded by the children he loved so much, and Claire and Joe were finally beginning to fill the emptiness they had carried all their lives. Let's take it one step at a time, said Joe. And when you're better, we'll look for our brothers. Together. Robert smiled, his eyes full of hope. Together. Yes, together. Over the next few days, Robert's recovery was slow, but steady. Claire and Joe were by his side whenever they could, taking turns between the hospital and their own lives. The connection between them grew with every conversation, and little by little, the mistrust and fear that Robert would disappear again was replaced by a sense of family they had never known. One afternoon, while Claire and Joe were sitting by Robert's bedside, he finally seemed to have enough energy for a longer conversation. His face was less pale, and his eyes, although still tired, showed a clarity they hadn't had before. I know you want answers, Robert began, looking at them both. And I want to give them to you. But you need to understand that the life I led after I lost everything wasn't pretty. I'm not the person you'd like to call father. Claire exchanged a look with Joe and then replied, her voice calm. We're not here to judge the past, Robert. We're here to rebuild. We've all had our struggles. Robert nodded, but still looked tormented. When I lost your mother, I lost myself too. I sank into drugs. I couldn't deal with the pain. It was like I was trying to numb myself so I wouldn't feel anything anymore. And eventually, it consumed me. He paused, taking a deep breath. And when you took me away, I knew I had failed completely. Joe leaned forward, his eyes serious. It wasn't just your fault. The whole system failed us. They separated us, threw us away from each other. It's not just your fault. Robert looked at Joe with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Even so, I never fought for you. I never went after trying to make it better. Until it was too late. I was too trapped in my own hell. Then Claire, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke up. But now you have the chance to change that, Robert. We're here, and you have the opportunity to make it different. But Robert nodded slowly, and for the first time since he woke up, he seemed to accept reality. He took a deep breath, trying to pull himself together. I want this. I want to make a difference. But what haunts me are the others. Your brothers. I don't even know where they are. We'll find them, said Joe firmly. No matter what happened in the past, now is the time to bring us all together. You don't have to do it alone. Robert looked at Joe with surprise, as if he had never considered that he would have the support of his children on this journey. He opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of a nurse entering the room to check his vital signs. While the nurse worked, Claire and Joe moved away, giving him space, but exchanged complicit glances. They were ready to embark on the search for the other brothers, even though they knew it would be a difficult journey. Later, when the nurse left, Robert looked at them both with a weak smile. I don't know where to start, he admitted. Claire approached, taking a seat beside the bed. I think the first step is to look for the adoption records. They should have information about who adopted our siblings. We can start there. Robert nodded, still with an expression of doubt on his face. I just don't want you to be disappointed. Maybe they don't want to see me, or they don't even know who I am. We know that's a possibility, said Joe calmly. But we're not going to give up before we try. They have a right to know the truth, even if it's hard for all of us. Claire nodded. And we also have the right to try to find them. We're a family, even if it took us so long to realize it. Robert looked at them both, clearly moved by what they were saying. For so many years, he had considered himself unworthy of any kind of redemption. But now, with his children by his side, hope seemed real, palpable. Robert paused, trying to control the tears that were threatening to flow. I just wish I'd done things differently. And now you can, said Claire with a gentle smile. The important thing is what we do from now on. Silence settled over the room for a few minutes, but this time it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that came with the relief of finally being able to face the truth, without any more secrets or fears. When I'm stronger, let's go to the orphanage together, Robert suggested. Maybe they have some records that can help us. Yes, we will, agreed Joe. But for now, you need to concentrate on recovering. We need you fully fit for what lies ahead. Robert laughed slightly, which surprised both Claire and Joe. They had never seen him laugh before, and it was a sound that gave them both hope. I'll do my best, said Robert. For you, and for myself. Claire felt a wave of emotion when she heard those words. They were finally on their way to healing the wounds of the past, to reconnecting a family that fate had torn apart. There was still much to be done, and the emotional scars on all of them would not be easily healed. But for the first time, Claire felt that they were on the right track. As the three of them talked about the next steps, about how they would find their lost brothers, Claire couldn't help but feel a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The journey would be long and full of obstacles, but they were no longer alone. Now, together, they were ready to face the future, leaving behind the weight of the past. After weeks of uncertainty and daily visits to the hospital, the day finally arrived. Robert was discharged. He was still weak, but the change in his countenance was evident. His eyes, once dimmed by pain and the weight of the past, now shone with new hope. Claire and Joe helped him leave the hospital, and Claire's small apartment became the temporary place where he would stay until he recovered completely. On their first night at home, after preparing a simple dinner, Claire, Joe, and Robert sat at the table, trying to get used to the new dynamic of being together. Like a family that, although fragmented by so many years, was rebuilding itself. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but charged with emotion and anticipation for what was to come. I think we should start the search tomorrow, said Claire, breaking the silence. If we go to the orphanage and get more information about our brothers, maybe that will give us a starting point. Robert nodded, picking at his plate with his fork, but he wasn't very hungry. He was clearly thinking. Are you too sure you want to go through with this? He asked, his voice low and full of uncertainty. I don't know what we're going to find. Maybe they don't want to know about me or us. Joe, sitting opposite him, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. We have no guarantees, Dad, that's true. But we have to try. We've spent our whole lives feeling that something was missing. Now we finally have the chance to fill that void. If they don't want to see us, well, at least we'll know we tried, Claire nodded in agreement. And it's not just about you, Robert. It's about all of us. Finding our brothers is part of our own healing process, and they also have the right to know who we are. Even if things don't turn out the way we hope, at least we'll have the answers. Robert sighed, clearly moved by his children's support, but still carrying an internal weight. He looked at Joe and Claire, who were waiting patiently for his answer. He hesitated. I feel like I don't deserve this second chance. You're being much more generous to me than I could have imagined. Claire smiled gently. Everyone deserves a second chance, Robert. No matter what happened in the past, you're trying now. And that's what matters. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Robert, who for so long had isolated himself in guilt and regret, now saw a small possibility of redemption ahead of him. and all thanks to Claire and Joe's determination to rebuild what had been lost. The next morning, they prepared for the journey to the orphanage, where Claire and Joe had been adopted. The place wasn't too far away, but the journey felt heavy, as if they were about to unearth a past buried long ago. On the way, Claire looked out of the car window, her mind full of thoughts. What would they find there? Would her brothers be receptive? Or would they prefer to carry on with their lives, unaware of the truth? She knew the possibility existed, but something inside her pushed her to keep going, to seek the truth, whatever lay ahead. "Are you nervous?" Joe asked, breaking the silence. Claire looked away from the window and stared at him for a moment before answering. "A little, yes, but I guess that's normal, right? We don't know what we're going to find. What if they don't want to see us?" Joe shrugged with a serene expression. "Then we move on. But we have to try." Robert, in the back seat, was quiet. He could hear his children talking, but seemed immersed in his own thoughts. From time to time, he let out a deep sigh, as if trying to relieve the tension that had accompanied him since the beginning of this new journey. When they finally arrived at the orphanage, the building seemed smaller than Claire remembered. There was a strange feeling of déjà vu as they walked up to the entrance, as if something was about to be revealed. Inside the building, the smell of old paper and weathered wooden furniture filled the air, and an employee welcomed them with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" asked the woman behind the counter. Claire stepped forward. "We're adopted, and we're trying to find information about our biological siblings. Our records are here." The woman frowned, looking at them curiously. "Of course. Please follow me to the archive room." She led them down a narrow corridor to a small room with shelves full of folders and documents. While she looked through the records, Robert stood next to his children, visibly tense. Claire and Joe were also anxious, every second seeming to drag by. Finally, the woman returned with 2 folders in her hands. "Here are your files, and from what I can see, you have 2 other brothers." She looked at them with a neutral expression, but her eyes showed understanding. One was adopted by a family in another state, and the other, well, it looks like he's still here, in the foster system. Claire's heart raced. One of the brothers was still in the system? That meant he had never been adopted, that he was still somewhere, waiting. "Can you give us more information about what happened to them?" Joe asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The employee nodded and handed them the folders. "You can look through the files, but I advise you to prepare yourself emotionally. Stories aren't always easy to hear." As Claire opened the file, the world around them seemed to slow down. The truth was there, in front of them, in words and numbers. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages, and she knew at that moment that this journey was going to be more difficult than she had imagined. But there was no turning back. They were committed to finding their brothers and, with that, to bringing back the lost parts of their lives. Robert approached, placing a trembling hand on Claire's shoulder. "No matter what happens, I'm here with you. We'll get through this together." Claire looked at him, feeling a surge of emotion. For the first time, she knew that, no matter what the outcome, they were finally starting to heal, together. After the discovery at the orphanage, Claire, Joe, and Robert were silent for some time. The fact that one of the siblings was still in the foster system came as a shock to everyone. Robert blamed himself even more, feeling the weight of knowing that one of his children had spent his whole life without a permanent family. But Claire and Joe were determined to carry on. If there was one thing they could do now, it was to ensure that all the siblings were reunited and could find some kind of peace. Sitting in the orphanage waiting room, Joe broke the silence. "We need to find our brother as soon as possible," he said, his voice full of conviction. "If he's still in the system, we don't know what he's been through or where he is now." Claire agreed, still processing what they had discovered. She looked at the documents in her hands, the younger brother's name marked in small, formal letters. Michael, adopted but returned to the system. Suddenly, a wave of sadness washed over her at the thought of what he might have faced. "Let's try to find Michael first," said Claire. "If he's still here, we can visit him, explain what happened. He deserves to know that he has a family, even if he's never felt it." Robert was sitting next to them, his head down, his face aged and marked by guilt and regret. "I don't know if he'll want to see me," Robert whispered, his voice laden with pain. "I don't know if he'll forgive me for all this." Claire looked at her father, empathy in her eyes. We can't control his reaction, Robert, but what we can do is show him that we're here now, that he has brothers, that he has a family. Joe nodded. And if he doesn't want to see you now, it may take time, but that's something we'll all have to deal with. The important thing is that he knows that we exist and that we're here for him. Robert sighed, still hesitant, but he knew they were right. He had spent so many years running away from pain and guilt that facing this reality now seemed overwhelming. However, there was no turning back. His children were determined, and he couldn't stop them. "All right, we'll find him," Robert said at last. "I can't change the past, but if he gives me a chance, I'll do my best to make amends." With this decision, Claire and Joe went back to the receptionist at the orphanage and asked for more information about Michael's whereabouts. The woman typed into the system for a few minutes, checking the boy's history. "It seems that Michael is in a temporary foster home here in the city," she said. "He hasn't been adopted by any family since he was returned to the system, but he's been living with a temporary family for the last few months. I can give you the address so you can pay them a visit." Claire felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The idea of finally meeting her brother, seeing his face and being told about Joe and Robert's existence was exciting, but also frightening. They didn't know how Michael would react, and there was a possibility that he wouldn't want any contact. However, their determination to go ahead overcame any fear. They got the address and drove to the foster home the next day. The drive there was silent, with a heavy air of expectation. When they arrived, they saw a simple but welcoming house with a small garden in front. Claire took a deep breath before getting out of the car, and Joe followed close behind. Robert remained in the car, hesitant to take part in the first meeting. "I think you'd better go first," he said. "I don't want to scare him off right away. If he asks for me, then you call me." Claire and Joe agreed, understanding the sensitivity of the situation. They walked together to the door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, a middle-aged woman opened the door, looking surprised to see the two of them there. "Can I help you?" she asked with a polite smile. "Hi, my name is Claire and this is my brother Joe," Claire began cautiously. "We're here to see Michael. We have something important to tell him, about his family." The woman frowned, clearly surprised. "Oh, of course. Michael is here. He's in the yard, playing ball. I'll call him," she said before disappearing into the house. Claire felt her heart race. This was the moment. The back door opened and a boy of about 15 walked in, with a curious and suspicious expression on his face. His dark hair fell slightly over his eyes, and he was wearing a soccer shirt. "Who are you?" Michael asked bluntly, looking at Claire and Joe with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Joe stepped forward, trying to be as direct as possible. "Hi, Michael. My name is Joe, and this is my sister Claire. We're your biological siblings." Michael stood still, processing what had been said. The expression on his face tightened, and for a moment Claire thought he was going to run or ask them to leave. "What do you want from me?" Michael asked, his voice harsh. "Why are you here now?" Claire felt the pain in his words, understanding perfectly the resentment he carried. "We're not here to ask for anything," she said softly. "We only found out about you recently. We didn't know we had a brother. But now that we know, we want to get to know you. We haven't come to force you into anything. We just want to give you the chance to know that you have a family." Michael crossed his arms, his eyes full of suspicion. "What about my father?" he asked in a challenging tone. "Is he here?" Joe nodded, and before he could answer, Michael interrupted. "Where has he been all these years? Didn't he want me?" Claire felt a wave of sadness at hearing this, and it was she who answered. "Michael, our father is here. He's in the car, and he feels very guilty about everything that's happened. He never stopped thinking about you, but things got out of hand. He wants to see you, if you're ready." Michael was silent for a moment, staring at the floor. Then finally, he took a deep breath and shrugged. "I think I can talk to him," he said without much emotion, but clearly trying to protect himself from the maelstrom of feelings. Claire looked at Joe, who went out to the car to call Robert. The moment was finally about to happen. Robert got out of the car with cautious steps, and when Michael saw him, he stood still. Robert stopped in front of his son and with a shaky voice said, "Michael, I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was full of unspoken emotions. And at that moment, they knew that, although the journey was difficult, they were finally beginning to find the missing pieces of their lives. The reunion between Robert and Michael was an emotionally charged moment. Michael stood motionless, watching the man he knew to be his father, but had never really met. Robert, for his part, seemed unable to find the right words. Guilt and regret were etched on his features, and he couldn't disguise the pain of seeing his son, now a teenager, who had grown up without him. "Michael," began Robert hesitantly, "I know I can't change the past. I know I let you down and that I was never there for you, but if you give me a chance, I'd like to make things right." Michael stared at him, his eyes full of mistrust and pain. "You want to make it right now, after all these years?" he asked, his voice low but full of restrained emotion. "Where were you when I needed you? I went from one family to another. No one wanted to stay with me. Why didn't you come to me?" Robert swallowed, his voice failing as he tried to explain. I was lost. When I lost your mother, I lost everything. I sank into drugs, into despair, and I ended up losing you. I have no excuses for what happened, but I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving you." Michael crossed his arms, trying to keep a firm posture, but it was clear that those words were stirring something in him. "So why only now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Only now do you want to come out?" "Because I was afraid," Robert admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought it was too late, that you would never forgive me. But your brothers, Claire and Joe, made me realize that we still have a chance to be a family, if you like." Michael looked away, clearly struggling with the tide of emotions he was feeling. Claire and Joe watched in silence, respecting his space. It was a crucial moment, and they knew they needed to let him make his own decisions. After a long silence, Michael finally spoke, his voice softer but still laden with pain. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I want a family now. I've spent too long trying to survive on my own." He shrugged as if trying to protect himself. "But maybe I can try. Just don't expect it to be easy." Robert nodded quickly, feeling a wave of relief, even though he knew the journey wouldn't be simple. "I understand, Michael. I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I'm just asking for a chance to be in your life, the way you want it. If that means starting slowly, we'll start slowly." Claire took a step forward, sensing that it was time to get closer. "Michael, we know it won't be easy. Neither of us has had an easy life. But now that we've found each other, we want to try together. I know it may sound strange, but we're here for you, both Joe and me. We're your brothers, and we want you to know that you're not alone." Joe nodded, agreeing with Claire's words. "You don't have to decide anything now, but we're here. If you want to be part of this, we'll support you, no matter what happens." Michael remained silent for a few moments, his face still closed in an expression of uncertainty. He looked at Claire and Joe, then at Robert, and finally let out a long, deep sigh. "I think I can try," he said, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to the others. "But I need time. I don't know how to feel about all this." "Of course, Michael. We'll respect your time," Claire replied with a soft smile. "Nobody expects you to make a decision now. We just want you to know that we're here, ready when you are." And Michael nodded, and although he still looked suspicious, there was an openness in his posture. It was a small step, but it was a start. Over the next few days, the relationship between the four of them slowly began to develop. Michael was still reserved and kept a certain distance, but Claire and Joe did their best to get close to him, without pressuring him. Robert, for his part, respected his son's space, aware that it would take patience and care to win his trust. One afternoon, when the four of them were gathered at Claire's house, Michael finally asked a question that everyone knew would come at some point. "What about our other brothers?" he asked, looking directly at Claire and Joe. "Do you know where they are?" Claire and Joe exchanged glances, both feeling the weight of the question. It was something they had already discussed in private, but they didn't want to burden Michael with more information before he was ready. "We're still looking," Claire replied cautiously. "We know there's another brother, but he was adopted by another family and lives in a different state. We're trying to find information, but we don't have many leads yet." "When we do," continued Joe, We want you to be with us, but we'll go at your pace without rushing. Michael seemed to think for a moment before nodding. I want to meet everyone, but I need to prepare for it. Robert, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke, his voice low but full of emotion. Whatever the future holds, I'm here. No matter how long it takes, I'm here for all of you. The silence that followed was filled with deep, unspoken feelings, but there was also a sense of relief and hope. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, they all knew they were no longer alone. The family was somehow rebuilding. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for healing, redemption, and above all, love. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this one, we have prepared the next video just for you. Click here to watch.